Welcome to Write Good, the podcast that helps you write good. I'm R.S. Benedict. Genre fiction is full of larger-than-life protagonists. Superheroes, white-hatted lawmen single-handedly taming the West, chosen ones destined by prophecy to do battle against the forces of darkness. But what about the rest of us? What about the nobodies, the losers, the has-beens, the ordinary people trying to make their way through the world? Aren't their stories worth telling, too? Joining us by phone is JR Dawson, whose short stories have appeared in the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, Mothership Zeta, and Richard Horton's 2018 Best of the Year anthology. Hi, Jen. Tell us a little more about yourself.
Hi. So I mostly write short stories, and I like to focus on sort of ordinary people dealing with ordinary issues that we all are going through, but with an extraordinary background and a speculative bend. So one of my friends said that my writing is like Willa Cather in space, and I was like, I'll take it. So yeah, that's that.
Nice. The reason I wanted to invite you onto the podcast is I've noticed that a lot of your fiction is, well, as you said, about regular people or humble people or people who are on the periphery of greatness. Like in Marley and Marley, the main character is a time traveler who goes back in time and sort of foster mothers her previous self. And in one part, she meets the person who will later become the President of the United States. But there's no dramatic meeting between them, like the protagonist doesn't rescue her from a truck or anything. The entire conversation is just a customer service transaction. Here's your change, thanks, have a nice day, and that's it. Why do you focus on these smaller stories about ordinary people and not, say, the person who saves the future president of the United States from getting hit by a truck or whatever?
So I think that there has been a tradition in literature and in life to really focus on these sort of superficial things that define an important person. So for example, in the Greek times, in order to be a tragic hero, you had to be a king or a god. You couldn't be a woman. You couldn't be a slave. You couldn't be, a farmer. So that has definitely transitioned into the modern day. And I think that in my own life,
Right.
I think that especially us as millennials, we felt this pressure growing up. Well, you have to have the biggest house. You have to have, you have to have the fanciest beachside, whatever, and have 3 cars and 4 children and 5 dogs. And I think that we've learned through the last 20 years now that sometimes the world's on fire, and the most important thing is finding love and finding peace within yourself. So in Marley and Marley, I was actually really surprised when readers really focused on the president part, because for me, I was just like, oh yeah, well, I mean, we brush elbows with people who are going to be deemed important every day. For example, when I was a kid starting off with acting classes, I went to my theater with Andrew Reynolds, who's now like this big Broadway star. He was in Girls, he was in the original cast of Book of Mormon, but at the time, like, he was just some dude who was in the older kids class. And so for me, like, the most important person in Marley and Marley was Jason, who's the husband, because he is the person that they're trying to save. And I thought that it was really interesting that the Marleys and Jason kind of sort of, I don't want to give it away, but they're not being looked at as closely as somebody who's in the literal binder of very important people, because they're deemed not important, but the entire story is about them because they are very important. They're very real, and they have very real scars and very real love.
Right. Now, we've met before, and in the past, I think you once mentioned that being from the Midwest really influences this aspect of your work. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So growing up, there is this push in Nebraska that if you want to be somebody, you have to go to the coast or further away. And that if you stay, then you're going to live an ordinary life, I guess. And I really felt that pressure growing up to get out. And when I went to Chicago, a lot of people didn't know where Nebraska was.
How?
I don't know. One time I was taking a plane back from Omaha to Chicago, and somebody asked me if I was going to be jet lagged and if I was going to make it to class, and I was like, we're in the same time zone. It's an hour. Okay. So coming back and having sort of that mind frame of, Chicago is full of important people and Omaha isn't. And then living here in my adult years and realizing like, well, that's a bunch of hooey.
Right.
I think that really inspired me to write about where I come from, write about the flyover area.
Yeah.
And so I always try to make Nebraska or somewhere near Nebraska sort of the epicenter of what is going on in the story. Another thing really interesting about Omaha is that we are the Forrest Gump of history. Like every time that something interesting has happened, especially in American history, we were like on the edges of the photograph. So like the Enola Gay was built here.
Huh.
And Warren Buffett comes from here, Henry Fonda comes from here, Malcolm X was born here. I'm trying to think what else. There was a major metropolitan First Nations city that's only like an hour and a half away from here in Missouri. So you have all of these moments in history. Oh, we had Standing Bear had its trial here. So all of these really small moments or big moments that then Omaha has played a small part in. Abraham Lincoln comes at one point and looks across the river and he's like, oh, what is that? And the people in Council Bluffs are like, oh, that's Omaha. You don't want to go there. So it's sort of like that one person was here once. And it was really interesting to grow up as like a history buff, like living in a city that was a part of it, but was like not a part of it.
Right. Right. That's neat. One of your stories, The Legendary Legend of the Darkly Slayer, really picks apart the Chosen One narrative that's popular in tons of fantasy novels. Could you talk a little bit about the Chosen One narrative and why you chose to subvert that?
Yeah, sure. So I was in undergrad when I first read Virginia Woolf's If Shakespeare Had a Sister. It's a portion of A Room of One's Own. And it was the first time that I heard anyone challenging the canon. And I realized that maybe the people who come out on top of history and any kind of canon aren't necessarily the people who were the best, but the people who had the most privilege.
Right.
So it's kind of looking back at history, a couple of examples that I wrote down. For example, we know about Valley Forge, and we know that was a moment in the American Revolution. And George Washington is known, Aaron Burr is known, obviously Alexander Hamilton is known. But when I started to collect stories from more marginalized voices to teach to some of my students, I was told about Polly Cooper, who was an indigenous woman who actually saved everybody at Valley Forge. And I had never heard of her before, and none of my students had heard of her before.
Wow.
Yeah, she fed everyone because they were all starving, and if it hadn't been for this woman, then nobody would have survived the winter. Another example really came up in David McCulloch's John Adams. We see John Adams, and right next to him, the arguably smarter Abigail Adams. And Abigail wasn't allowed in the Congress because she's a woman.
Right.
So she showed her strength being at home with the kids while they were battling fever and taking care of the farm and keeping everybody together while John was off in Europe forever. And sometimes people I know that John definitely wrote her and asked for advice. And
wow.
So really the only reason why she wasn't in the Congress is because she was the woman of the family, and number one, she wouldn't have been allowed, and number two, they had a bunch of kids that, was her responsibility just by default. And I know that there's a book coming out, I'm trying to remember who wrote it. Marie Lu has a book coming out about Mozart's sister.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and Mozart's sister was actually...
She was brilliant.
Yeah, way more talented than Wolfgang, but she was a girl. So, and this isn't... I mean, this is just all the way through history of who are we missing out on and whose story did we not hear. So I think that I just started to question, like, okay, so Chosen One are they really the chosen one? Or are they just the person who had the loudest voice and the most money at the time?
Right.
So yeah, that's where Annie and her buddy came in.
That's right. Yeah, that story of Mozart's sister just really makes me mad.
Yeah.
Like, we really missed out on another incredibly talented musician, really talented voice. For our listeners who aren't as familiar with the story, Mozart had a sister who was just as good as he was. She was composing and performing with him at a super young age, like 4 years old or something, like ridiculously young like that. And instead of growing up to be a musician like he did, she just got married, and that was it.
Yep.
Just sort of like, yeah, you don't need to be a brilliant musician anymore. You're married. Just go have kids. Well, can I do both? No.
Of course not. You must choose.
Nope. Instead of having this amazing team of like brother and sister who were brilliantly talented working together, and maybe she could have helped her brother stay sober and not die. I don't know. So we could have had even more of both of them. We just lost her. She's just stopped.
Oh, yeah.
And that really sucks.
Yeah. Yeah. And the more you look at history, the more of sisters like that you find. So.
Yeah, it's really frustrating. Yeah. Moving on. There's been a lot of talk about writing strong female characters, but at least one of your stories, When We Flew Together Through the Ice, focuses on what many people would consider to be a weak female character. The protagonist is a total mess who really does not overcome her circumstances at all. What made a character like that so compelling to you?
I think that it was honest to the character. That story is definitely the darkest thing that I've written.
It is. It's so great.
Dark. But yeah, Maribel is definitely very flawed, and she is a victim in her own way. I have a lot of feels about the end of that story. Yeah,
it feels very truthful to me, though.
Yeah, it's where the characters took the story, and I was like, no, stop. But I think that I had to be honest and true to Maribel because I think that in order to have actual equality in our writing and in the stories we tell, like, women need to be able to be flawed, and they need to be wrong sometimes. It's not interesting for Maribel to, like, you know, get together at the end, like get all of her stuff together at the end and sully through if that's not what she's feeling.
Right.
So I was talking about Greek heroes, the tragic heroes earlier, where you have the tragic hero, and because of their hubris or their pride or their flaw, then they fall. And so Arthur Miller argued, well, you don't have to be a king or a god to fall a long ways. You can just be a normal, everyday person. And he brings this into Death of a Salesman, which he wrote in mid-20th century. So Willy Loman is actively trying to kill himself in that story, and he succeeds at the end. Spoiler. And he is kind of a mess up. Like, he's cheating on his wife. He's a horrible father to his 2 kids. And it does have a poignant ending, but while he does achieve his goal of, you know, taking his life, like, he doesn't achieve his goal of being a good salesman, of being a good family member, of being a good man. And everybody was cool with that. But if you look at earlier than that, you've got Ibsen's Doll's House, where Nora isn't a perfect person and walks out at the end. Spoiler.
Right.
And
that must have shocked people at the time.
There was actually a riot. Yeah, there was a real riot that happened when Doll's House opened, and people were horrified and just, like, very disturbed by the idea that this woman on stage could be making this questionable choice, which you know, it's questionable however you look at it, but but she's not a perfect, you know, strong person. Like, she's like, I've had it, I'm done, I'm out, and she abandons her kids and her family and scoots. But, you know, so it was okay for Willie to be a terrible parent and a terrible spouse, but for Nora there was a riot.
Yeah.
And so I think that when we hit the equilibrium of both of those characters being okay, for it to be okay that Maribel does not come out on top smelling like roses, then we have hit, you know, that feminist perspective that we're hoping for.
Absolutely. All right. Now, you mentioned a riot. I'm guessing you haven't had any riots in response to your work, but have you gotten any negative reactions based on your decisions to focus on weaker characters or to have a downer ending?
Yes. So it's not so much the ending. I've been surprised that sometimes people are, excuse me, they see some of the characters as not likable, not
Yeah.
which is weird. So Marley and Marley, a couple of people thought that the two Marleys themselves were not likable, and I was like, well, they're humans.
Yeah.
And so I think that sometimes femme characters are put under a deeper microscope, or maybe even like a more shallow microscope. Because
Right.
we see that women characters are women and then characters, and maybe that's it.
Right.
But I like to think about gender bending a lot, and I actually have played a lot of gender bent characters as an actor. I got to play Ben Franklin in an all women's cast of 1776, and
Oh, that's fun.
it was so much fun. But whenever I see a gender bent character, I wonder like, okay, so if this was a man. How would this be different than it being a woman? My friend and I were thinking about doing Last 5 Years as a gender bent play, as Jamie being the woman and Kathy being the man. And it came off really terribly, actually, so we didn't do it. But the Last 5 Years, Kathy is... Oh, this is going into a tangent. But Kathy has a certain reaction to Jamie that when put to a male counterpart, there's a lot more connotation and a lot more privilege and power that goes with that makes it terrifying. Whereas, in the original, it isn't that terrifying. So it's interesting that when you bring different privileges or oppressions into different characters, like how does that change the framework that we are reading them as or seeing them as?
Right. That's something I've wondered about too. I've definitely gotten that complaint. Oh, I didn't like her much more for female characters, which I find kind of interesting. I'm like, I don't care. I'm not here to make friends. Like a reality show contestant. I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to win. Oh, gosh. Now, I've seen a lot of geek feminists talk about body positivity in media representation, saying they want to see bodies presented on screen that are imperfect, like a little chunky, a little stretch marked. Because media with nothing but perfect bodies in it can kind of hurt us by giving us this impossible standard of beauty that we compare ourselves to. Do you think that there could be a case for showing imperfect personalities in characters? Selfishness, extreme anxiety, cluelessness, flaws that aren't corrected or aren't totally defeated at the end? Can media that only showcases super strong, super noble, morally perfect people be harmful in the way that media that only showcases physically perfect people can be?
I think so. That's a hard question. So, I think that as writers, as storytellers, we do have a responsibility to the readers and to what we are putting out there in the world. So for somebody who super loves YA, I know that there is a lot of argument about how moral does YA get, how immoral does YA get. But I also have an education background where I always have my first instinct is protect the children, not don't cover them in styrofoam and bubble wrap, but also what am I putting out there, what kind of vibes am I putting out there in the world, and how can it be seen incorrectly or used for something that I don't want it to be used for. So that's really hard. So I think that seeing somebody physically diverse is a little different than seeing somebody morally diverse. And it really depends on how they're framed. So there's the whole thing about save the cat, which is,
right,
for people who don't know, that means that when you have an unlikable character or a flawed character in the first chapter, you need to have them save a cat, or do something that makes us really feel for them and actually still care about them. And this is something that I just ran into this summer. I co-authored a manuscript with my friend R.M. Romero, and it is about Charles Dickens and Hans Christian Andersen, the summer that they met up.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a historical fantasy, and I'm super excited about it. But she took Hans Christian Andersen, and I took Charles Dickens, and then we co-wrote it. And the more that I researched Charles Dickens, the more I realized how much of an awful human being he was. And he is not the villain of the story. So
yeah, Hans Christian Andersen, I understood, was absolutely nuts that whole summer. Like, wasn't the first thing he did come to announce, in my culture, it's absolutely customary for the son of the host to kiss the guest on the face. I have to make out with your son now.
And to shave,
which is
he wanted to shave.
Rude.
He was so rude. He was the worst. But he was such a little cinnamon bun. But he was just really, like, socially awkward. During our research, we found out that when he arrived at Charles Dickens' country home, Charles Dickens had moved into the country home 3 days prior, and the plumbing wasn't even working. So yeah, we had a lot of fun with it. My biggest concern with it was that I was going to have to write this man as a likable person, and and this man was a real person, and I couldn't condone him, like I couldn't P.T. Barnum him, like in The Greatest Showman. So we had to do this weird balancing act of, okay, we have to stay true to who he is, but also we have to make it so people will follow these two through 92,000 words.
Right.
So I think that it's a balancing act, that we can have flawed, morally corrupt characters, but how are we going to frame them within that story? And how do other people see them in the story and in that world? And I don't think that they have to come out smelling like roses, but I also don't want anybody being like, that Charles Dickens, he got it figured out. I'm going to go cheat on my wife.
His attitude toward women was really good.
Oh, Lord.
it was very
so
bad.
No.
I'm going to go to the morgue and look at a dead person. That was one of the things he did for funsies, right?
Yep, that is true. Indeed.
Yeah, that's healthy and normal. Hashtag role model.
Hashtag Dickens.
It was a weird time.
It was.
Yeah. Pretty weird that was legal. So for the record, for our listeners, Charles Dickens used to like to go down to the morgue to look at the bodies of dead people that were on display. If you committed suicide, your body would be put on display as some sort of weird public exhibition as a sort of punishment, but also so that creepy weirdos could look at ooh, a girl killed herself.
They were in
Charles
the windows.
Dickens was
That's
super
right.
into it.
I forgot that.
Very normal.
Oh, because the CPR dummy's one of those girls.
God.
Oh, okay.
Nice. Healthy society. Okay, cool. So, moving on. Who are some of your favorite losers or weak characters in literature? Some of my examples, I love J. Alfred Prufrock, who is a weak little man from an absolutely beautiful poem. I love Ophelia. She's a total mess, but she's sort of the only human and the kind of reminder that in the middle of all this scheming, there's a human being who's just sort of frail and not monstrous enough, and she just can't survive. She's like the canary in a coal mine. And honestly, my favorite character from Hunger Games is Effie.
Yes.
So I just find her so compelling in that she's this weak character who has this horrific job where she's supposed to meet a new pair of kids, give them a makeover, and watch them die year after year after year. And she doesn't have the strength, the intelligence, the skills to fix it. All she can do is get them nice outfits and give them snacks. And that's it.
A nice train ride.
Yeah, let's go on a nice train ride. Let's get you a makeover, girl. That's all she can do. And I find that so compelling.
I always think about the scene, isn't it, in Mockingjay, where they finally see her, or is it? Yeah, it's Mockingjay, where she's down in District 13, and they finally see her, and she's stripped of all of her capital gear, and she's just kind of sitting there, and she's not a hero, and she's not getting ready for battle or anything. She's just kind of well, here I am.
Yeah. So who are some of your favorite losers or weak characters in pop culture or in serious literature? Either way.
Yeah. So the first character that I ever saw be a turncoat, like a super weak loser character turned into a hero, was this is so nerdy, Iago in the Aladdin series. I was a kid, and when Return of Jafar came out, which was like this it was this direct-to-DVD sequel. And Iago, he really sticks his neck out for the good guys and almost dies, and then like sort of becomes a good guy for the rest of the lore. And that was the first time that I saw anything like that happen. I was like, oh, that's my favorite character now. Which, to dethrone the genie was a big deal. I think that to get more literary, Macbeth from the Scottish play definitely hits me, like, in my adult years, just the tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow monologue. Even after everything that he's done that is horrifying, like, he's killed children, and
right.
and he's, like, brought this castle to ruins, but his wife dies, and he goes into that monologue, and it just like brings me to tears every time. And one thing that really changed my perspective of Macbeth as a character, I think it was Ian McKellen was going to play him, and Patrick Stewart had played him, or one or the other. It was the two buddies, and one of them asked for help or advice, like, I'm going to take on this role, like, you know, what do you want me to keep in mind? And the one who had already played him said, in the tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, the emphasis is on and, not on tomorrow. And ooh. I was like, whoa! And just the idea of grief and loss, and how Macbeth is realizing that this loss hurts right now, but he has lost her forever. And right. And when you lose somebody who means so much to you, and then you see the expanse of the rest of your life without them, how heartbreaking that is. And I think it's amazing that we have this really horrible man who we really hate by Act 5, but in that scene, we feel so bad for him, and I think that I've connected with that monologue more than any other monologue. Like, even Mercutio, who's like my favorite Shakespeare character ever, you know, this horrible guy is giving this superhuman monologue about grief.
Right.
I also really love Edmund in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I feel really bad for him because he is a child.
Right. And he's hungry.
He's on rations. He just
wants some candy.
He's had no sugar for at least like a year. The kid was in the Blitz. Like, give him some sugar. Yeah. I also really love Zuko. Zuko is my dude from Avatar: The Last Airbender. And then a character that has been kind of a talking point this past year is Tony Stark. He is really interesting because in Endgame, this is an Endgame spoiler. In Endgame, I kind of walked out of there like, oh, he redeemed himself. Until I started talking to my friend Michael Van Kalberg, who's a poet, and I'm going to give him a shout out for this because this is not my original thought. He pointed out that Tony could have done anything with the Infinity Stones in the end, and he decided to commit genocide, which actually was the first choice that he made in the very first Iron Man with the Jericho. That he was about violence and death and killing on a mass level. He could have sent Thanos to, like, Z-Space, the Phantom Zone, or whatever the Marvel equivalent is of that. Like, he could have, you know, turned everybody good. He could have done anything. It was a Deus Ex Machina, and he decided to turn them to ash. And I was like, oh, man, he didn't learn anything. So I thought that was really interesting from a storytelling perspective. Yeah.
I see your notes also have Hades from Lore Olympus.
Yes. Okay. So I just started reading Lore Olympus, which is a webcomic by, I don't know her name, Rachel. And it's on Webtoon. And it is not finished, so I do not know what she is doing with this character. But something that is interesting about this character is that he is flawed, and everybody keeps pointing out that he looks a lot like his dad. And it goes into the whole, like, Kronos eating the kids, and it's been hinted at that 6 of the original gods like fought back against Kronos, and they're a legacy now and all this. But everybody keeps pointing out, Hades, you look so much like your dad. Oh, you're such a jerk like your dad. You're going to be a villain. And he's such a nice guy. Like, he's got like 5 like rescue dogs. He's trying to like keep Persephone safe during her internship. But like he also has these really deep flaws. Like he's on again, off again with this really horrible river nymph. And then in this one scene, he takes this paparazzi dude who took a picture of him and Persephone and ties him up in a warehouse and then like pulls out his eyeball. And while he's doing this, the artist Rachel Smith. All right, Rachel Smith, she illustrates him to look exactly like Kronos in those scenes. So his entire color scheme changes, and he looks just like Kronos as he's pulling this guy's eyeball out. But then in the next panel, it just goes back to the hijinks of the rom-com. And so I don't know where they're going with this, and I think it's really interesting that our leading man is an eyeball puller. I don't know what that means.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Let's see. Oh, I'm trying to think of another one. Twin Peaks, some of my favorite characters are like not the hero detective, but Big Ed. He's this unhappily married man he ended up marrying this woman that he doesn't really love out of pity, but he's sticking with her just again because he feels guilty because he accidentally shot out her eyeball. Speaking of eye
It's like the Great Comet musical, Josh Groban's character.
Oh, I don't know that one.
Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812, I think. It's based on a small chapter of War and Peace. And Josh Groban's character, and his name is Pierre. That's his name, like Natasha Pierre. Pierre is staying with his wife because he feels pity. He feels no love, but he feels pity. But then he's holding on to his wife while he's like going and trying to find love in these other places. And he's just a really weird, like not super strong, but also really lovable character. And I guess that my last example that I wrote down was, because you got to get the Harry Potter in. Harry Potter, well, everybody talks about Snape. Snape is problematic, but Sirius is also very problematic, and I don't know if Rowling knows how problematic Sirius is, but you really fall in love with Sirius as a kid. You know, he's everybody's favorite uncle, and then you grow up and you read some of the stuff that he does, primarily with Kreacher, the house elf, and you're like, oh, you're messed up. Okay. So yeah, those are my examples.
Nice. All right. I'm trying to think of good examples of losers, too. People who don't succeed just because I kind of like that. I kind of think that's healthy to see narratives about people who lose.
Yes.
Oh, gosh. What about Charlize Theron from Young Adult? I don't know if you've seen that one. She's a fucking disaster. I love her so much.
I still feel so bad for Patton Oswalt's character in that.
Oh, he's great. Speaking of losers, Patton Oswalt in
yes.
everything. Everything he's ever been in.
I love you, Patton.
Oh, he's amazing.
Yeah, he is. He really is.
Although he does get something he wanted. He does get to hook up with the prom queen, even though she's completely bananas.
She's very bananas.
She's very bananas, and it's glorious, and she learns nothing.
Absolutely nothing.
At all, which is my favorite aspect of the movie. She does not reform herself. She does not overcome her flaws. She just leaves.
Yep.
She eats some fried chicken, I think, and then she goes home.
Yeah.
After trying to destroy her ex-boyfriend's marriage.
It kind of reminds me of, there's a character in Something Rotten, the musical, Nick Bottom. I don't think he really learns anything either at the end of that musical. Just nothing. Oh, and then, of course, the musical's biggest loser is Aaron Burr.
Ooh.
In Hamilton. Have you seen Hamilton yet? Or
I have
Hamilton?
not.
Oh, my heart. So Aaron Burr is the villain of Hamilton. He's the one who shoots him in the duel. Historically, right. Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton got in the fight. So you know the whole time that he's going to do this, because in the first song he says, "I'm the damn fool who shot him."
Yeah.
And so at the end he's singing this song about how he he goes to a bar and gets a drink, and they say, you gotta run, and he runs, and he says, and now I'm the villain in your story, and, I made a mistake, and I mean, Burr pretty much died in exile in real life, and he's not a bad guy in the musical. He's, they frame it as he just didn't want to be shot because he had a daughter to take care of, and so he shoots Hamilton, and Hamilton doesn't shoot him. And when I was teaching it to my students last year, there was a question of whether or not Burr or Hamilton were the, which one was the protagonist, which one was the antagonist. Because Burr, honestly, is the one who changes, and is the one who isn't really instigating any of the conflict. And Hamilton's the one who doesn't really change. He, comes on in the first part, and he's like, I'm gonna be something. And then at the end, he's like, I've become something. Whereas Burr is like, I'm going to be something. And then he's like, oh, I can't be something. This Hamilton has me beat. Please don't kill me. So, yeah.
Nice. All right. So in short, losers are good. Flawed characters are good. Chosen ones are terrible. Chosen one narratives where the hero is just destined from birth to save the day because he has pure bloodline, I think might be a little problematic in certain ways, yeah?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, generally in real life, I think when someone's talking about how they were destined to rule because of their bloodline and the purity of their blood, something really fucked up's about to happen. There's either going to be an incest or a genocide.
Yeah.
When someone talks about bloodlines giving you the right to rule.
Yeah. And I think that, two stories come to mind is Harry Potter and the Arthur Legends.
Right.
Somebody was pointing out online at some point that in the Arthur Legends, the Lady of the Lake would have probably been a druid smith and not just some woman chilling in a lake.
Right.
Because of the ore and what you make the swords out of and stuff. And it's really interesting to see different adaptations of Arthur, and which ones focus on Arthur, which is pretty run-of-the-mill, oh, look, he was destined, he's Arthur's kid, and then he dies. Or those who are looking at Guinevere, and why Guinevere is in the position that she's in. Sometimes it's because she's trying to save her country. That's the best one that I found, is that she goes and becomes the queen in order to save her country from ruin and give them support. And there was that really weird show that came out where she was a Pict, but I don't know what that's about. Anyway, so the side characters have a lot more life going on for them. And then Harry Potter, I saw a post that somebody said, when you ask somebody who their favorite Harry Potter character is, you never hear Harry Potter.
Yeah.
And it's true. A lot of people are super into Neville and Draco and even Hagrid. Even the ones that are flawed, Dumbledore is extremely flawed, and he is a more interesting character than Harry. And I think it's because Harry doesn't really have a say in anything that is happening to him until the very end, when he has been groomed to make that decision. Whereas everybody else does have a say in what they're doing. Draco, yeah, he has a bloodline, or he's supposed to be evil Malfoy or whatever, but it is not as deeply entrenched as Dumbledore sitting there telling Harry, oh yes, you are the chosen one, you have the scar, you're gonna have to walk into the woods and blah, blah, blah.
Right, he could just say fuck you, Dad.
Yeah, and he does, kind of, or at least his mom does, so
yeah. All right. Now, before we go, is there anything else you'd like to plug?
Sure. So I've got 2 new stories coming out at some point, Lightspeed and Daily Science Fiction. So that will be coming out soon. I also have an exclusive serial that is updated monthly on my Patreon.
Nice.
It is called The Andrews, and it's about a family that is on a generation ship. So that's patreon.com/JR Dawson.
Nice. All right, now that's all for us this episode. If you like what you hear and you want to support us, then head on over to patreon.com/writegood, that's RITEGUD, and subscribe. Join us next time when we talk about originality. Is it really necessary? Thanks for listening.
This has been Write Good with R.S. Benedict, hosted by R.S. Benedict and produced by Matt Keeley for KS Media LLC. This has been a Kitty Sneezes production. For comments and concerns, please write to us at writegood@kittysneezes.com. That's RITEGUD at kittysneezes.com. If you'd like to support us, please visit our Patreon at patreon.com/writegood.
kittysneezes.com in color.